So I thought I would get all my Leelas recorded in the same space through video, and probably can transcribe this using AI, because I've got many of them and they're all remarkable. So it's important to share this, so people, if you can trust that what I'm saying is not fabricated or anything exaggerated even, it's truly extraordinary. So the first Leela with my beloved Heartmaster avatar Adidar Samraj. I was about, 23, 24. This is 1986, the 8th of May, and I was living in South London. I had finished university, I hadn't started any career yet, and I was in a grey zone, feeling too distraught about the nature of life to really have the motivation to take on a career. It seemed the end points of a career were, big car, nice house, all the other conventional things that I saw people readily take to, which for me, it was just too obvious that it's like an attempt at trying to make all of this sufficient, because for me it wasn't sufficient at all. I was looking through different religions, philosophies, reading, but just observing, and I always found that the people in different religions, the philosophies they expressed didn't make any fundamental difference to me. I was understanding something about my own experience that nothing that I read about or heard from people convinced me would sort of go away. I was unhappy in a way that was just intolerable, and I thank my master, Avatar Adidar Samraj, for literally showing me that happiness is possible, not just possible, it's the fundamental reality that we live in. So I knew nothing about Adidar. I checked out the Hare Krishna movement, I checked out different, Christian groups, one or two, the Quakers. My ex-girlfriend was a Baptist. Nothing appealed to me. I didn't really see the real interest value. It just seemed to me like different religions each have their own claim to exclusive reality, and that's already messed up. If religion is going to be true, I felt, then it must be universal. It doesn't require some cultural hallmark. So it had to be the thing itself. That's what I wanted. I wanted the actual living experience of liberation, happiness. And so I, exhausted that avenue through different religions, philosophies, whatnot. But I did go along with them. I did try to, check them out. So the Hare Krishna movement, because I found there was something interesting there about the meditation practice, which had very obvious results, that it made you feel relatively mindless, relatively calm, kind of happier, you could say. So there was something in that, and I decided to adopt that intense practice of doing the meditation chanting with the beads. Every morning I was doing 10 rounds on the beads, which is quite a lot, take about an hour and a half, 2 hours. And this particular morning, oh, okay, no, I have to qualify this. The day before, I had visited the Scientology Centre in London, having read the book Dianetics by L. Ron Hubbard, and I thought, again, it seemed to make a kind of sense. It wasn't sort of mythological so much, although, as I later found out, underneath that there's a whole load of nonsense. But there seemed to be a kind of pragmatic approach in there. So I read that book and I decided to have a session with one of their people. So I actually turned up in Tottenham Court Road. This is on May the 7th, the day before. And, volunteered myself in, and they were quite surprised because they said normally we have to get people to come in and they don't want to come in. But I just walked straight up to them and said, give me a session, So the session lasted about 6 hours, morning 3 hours, afternoon 3 hours. And basically it's a kind of recover memories that were painful or that affected you in a big way, and then emotionally release the charge of the pain of those memories. That's the idea of it. But it does have a kind of pre-verbal truth about it. It's not about belief. It's not you have to think this, this and this for you to benefit. You literally just consider and feel what your experiences were in the past very directly, so that you kind of re-experience the whatever it was that made you unhappy, and then it kind of releases, or it can release. So I did this session, went back to memories that some were painful, like when I was young, I was bullied by these two kids, and I particularly remember suddenly I saw that the pink pullover of the bully that had been holding me since I was about 8 years old, and I suddenly remembered that image was very strong. I think I must have experienced some kind of maybe a blow from the one he pulled me backwards. It was a traumatic moment, and it did become very strong, and I remember being angry at that memory, and it sort of did kind of open me up in some way. But at the end of that day, I actually felt worse than at the beginning of the day, probably because all these memories had been stirred up, and it builds up a kind of negativity into you. So I actually felt, oh, it's failed, it hasn't worked, it's not very useful, I feel worse. And I went home, and then the next morning I was still regularly doing this meditation of the Hare Krishna mantra. So that next morning, May the 8th, I felt, actually, this time I felt like a deep dread. Like I'd felt that occasionally in the past, a kind of mortal dread that this is what it must be like when you're aware that you're going to die, that kind of mortality. And I think it was related to the session I'd had that previous day. It kind of, because as I say, it stirred up a lot of emotions. So that morning I started to chant with the beads, having this feeling underlying. And then from the chanting, the effect was to make you very calm, very still. And my mind, I realized at one point, was just not doing anything. And my feelings were completely calm, completely still. And my body was completely still. And I got to this moment where it was like a summary singularity of awareness, no motion, no movement of my awareness. And in that moment, I suddenly saw, as clear as a bell, not abstractly, I saw and felt that I am the problem, if you like. The sense of being me is completely synonymous with the feeling of dissatisfaction, incompleteness, unhappiness. So I saw that and felt that suddenly, and then I also felt and saw very directly that it was my own gesture, that it was somehow connected with the heart, that I was crimping, squeezing myself into that shape, and then the rest of my life, the entirety of my life, had been built upon that. All this was in a very short space of time. It was a direct, intuitive awareness, and so when it happened, what did I do? Spontaneously, I stopped doing it, and suddenly, as I did that, my hands shot up into the air. It felt like my head opened like a book, my head, my throat, all the top part of me just opened, and my head went back, and I remember, strangely, crying out, "I'm so ashamed." No idea where that came from. So anyway, but that feeling occurred, and then it felt like something came down into me, not like a force. It was more like the doors were opening in my body all the way down, from the top down to the base of my body, and then they unzipped up my spine as well, and it all happened in half a second. It's completely automatic, and it was I just felt annihilated. I didn't have an ordinary perception, and then even more than that, I felt this polarity that reversed. I felt like I was rolling forward. I felt this piercing into my heart, this piercing, which was the best way to describe it. It's like a white hot poker pushing into you. It was the most painful thing I've ever felt, in the sense that everything I was this bundle, and this poker penetrated and pulled apart, forced, if you like, that bundle to release. So it was like dying, But again, none of this was controllable. This all happened, and as I say, within about a second. And then suddenly, I was completely released from any sense of being limited, and I also did actually see a white light, but it was more true to say that I was being a white light, and it was infinitely bright and infinitely energetic. You cannot contain that. It's not possible. So again, that lasted about half a second, and then suddenly I was, as it were, back. That brightness had changed its form. It wasn't the bright light anymore, but my body and my being and my awareness felt completely free, completely without any trace of this fear, this contraction from anything. And then, of course, immediately there is no separation between your ordinary state of awareness and anything else. There is no separation. It's not like you have to achieve non-separation. It's the truth that's already the case. That's the liberating fact, is that what I realized was utterly natural. It wasn't some weird kind of trick, you see. What was restored, what was the greatest benefit of that experience, and it was an experience, one of the greatest benefits was the fact that I realized that happiness is my very state, my very being, and that there is no separation, and there is no self, there is no ego self, the one who thinks he is separate. That it is not, except in the merest terms of just being this energetic body and mind, including all the parts of the mind, and even attention is just this kind of, if you like, robot that seems to be living the consciousness. So everything completely reversed for me. I was free from the fundamental thing that I had been suffering, and that understanding has informed me ever since. And then the more sort of miraculous side of this, if you like, was that when that experience happened, I was completely ecstatic. I was laughing and crying. I danced in my room. I just danced for like 2 hours, because the body was completely full of energy. And I would think about friends, relatives, and as the mind was completely different to how I normally related to it. In the mind, it's just like a picture show. It just shows things to you, and I wasn't identified with the mind. And as a result of that, the ability to use the mind is extraordinary. It obeys everything you ask it to do. I even remember testing it out, saying, what did I do 23 years ago on this day and date? And I sat there, and then, boom, it would come back to me. In other words, it was like I was talking to something else. That's how I was related to the mind. Not separately in the usual sense, but separate in the sense that I was not identified with it. I was in this different space, this completely free, happy space, which was capable of releasing everything instantly. And that was the bliss, is that you release everything. Everything. There's no form of anything which is worth its salt. Everything is released, and that itself was the happiness, you see. So that occurred, and then I, didn't know what to do. Or what do you do? So I jumped on my motorbike. I was living in South London, and I drove up to the West End of London for no reason other than, I went to the bank to, I can't remember, take some money out probably. And I remembered parking the bike in Berwick Street in the West End, just south of Oxford Road, and then going into the Nationwide Bank. And I remember going up this escalator up to the bank. It was on the first floor, and I was astounded that every person I looked at, I could see wasn't a person in the way that people usually think they are. Nobody. There's this mysterious being that seems to be all these separate people. And these apparently separate people are that same being, but they're kind of concentrated somewhere here behind the eyes, and they have this sense of being separate. And based on that, they're sort of deluded into thinking that they are sort of not what they actually are. Because what they actually are is the divine being, literally. It's so funny. I mean, I was just in stitches a lot of the time because it's so obvious. The thing that you hope you're going to find in the process of liberation, well, the joke is that it's always there. It's always there. It's just your take on it, you see. And when I had that relief from the self point of view, I could see that everything is this divine joke, this humorous thing. Women with makeup looked like kind of dollies. It was really bizarre, and they were, the way they looked and the way they consciously made their appearance was controlling the attention of males because they liked this kind of dolly look. It was really amazing to see things like that. I could see people's activity about what they were thinking, not literally all the content of it, but I could see the pattern. I remember looking in a shop window, and there was a woman inside the shop that was turned to face outward, the same to see me, as it were, but she didn't see me. But I was looking at her, and I saw the movement of her eyes because there was a person behind her, and her eyes were moving like shiftily. That she was doing some kind of number, strategically. And I had that awareness that I could see that this separate being that exists as all these other people is like strategic. It's a point of view, and it does things. It's all strategic, and I wasn't in that position. I was free of it, and it was a kind of joke to see it. So I had this extraordinary moment to moment, deeply pleasurable, deeply full release and happiness. And I was just looking around. I went to the bank. I laughed at the security guard who seemed to be constantly checking himself, and I could hear his sort of thoughts saying, yes, I do look like a proper security guard. I'm getting away with it. I'm looking like a security guard, If I looked at people or talked to them, they would often do a kind of double take, because I was so calm, so free, and so happy. There was something about it communicated, you see, of course. We're naturally attracted to real happiness, aren't we, And if you're really honest with yourself, you know that a lot of the things you kind of do for the sake of satisfaction or happiness aren't really cutting it. It's unmistakable, that happiness. Happiness is happiness. It's sanity. It's pleasure. And it's completely benevolent to everybody. It doesn't do what humans do, It doesn't discriminate like humans do. So I'm in this state, and I parked the bike, went to the bank, and then I just walking up one of the side streets off Oxford Road, Oxford Street, and I looked up and I saw this sky blue sign outside of a bookshop, I guess, and there was the shape of a white horse on its rear legs, sideways on, like a silhouette, white on a bright blue. And I looked at that, and I think even the colour blue sort of was connected to how I felt. That's the only way I can describe it. And it was attractive, and I saw this sign, and I thought, oh, okay, and I walked up to it. Now you got to understand, at this point, I'm no longer looking for the answer to anything. It came. Literally, I was living it. There it was. I didn't have any questions to ask anymore, or anything to find, But there's this sign. I go up to the thing, and I look in the bookshop, and there's quite a big photo of Adida sitting. I think he was in Hawaii at that time, looking back on it, with his arm resting on his knee. And I looked at this person, and I thought, he's the same as me. He knows what I know now. So I went into the shop, because this is like humorous, because I've already found what I want. I walked into the shop, and there's the guy at the reception, and there's all these kind of, again, attractively made white coated books. They just brought out the first edition of the Dawn Horse Testament, and so I saw that, and I saw other material, and I said to the receptionist humorously, what's his philosophy, because I was already in that condition that I had been hoping might be true, and he was kind of angry, and he said, oh, it's not philosophy, it's a real practice, it's a real thing. And again, I just registered his unhappiness, and I think that, yes, I got a magazine called The Laughing Man, one of the earlier editions. It had the title Sex, Laughter and God Realization on the front, which was pretty good. I thought, yeah, I like this. And so I just bought it, and without really thinking anything. And then I went from there to the south side of the River Thames, near Westminster Bridge, opposite the Houses of Parliament. It's a beautiful day, and I'm in this condition, right, where every moment was just a sort of unfolding of extreme fascinated pleasure. Nothing is the same every 5 seconds. Everything is totally different. Even if it's an object right in front of you, 5 seconds later it's in a different realm. Nothing is the same. So it's impossible to be bored, if you like. So I sat on this bench and I opened the magazine up, Laughing Man, and then it said on the front, "I am the realizer and the revealer of the divine person." And I thought, yeah, right, yeah, okay, that's right. Yes, of course. And I felt that this person, this human guru, was necessary for my continued reminder of this state, that he was that state. That's why I had the sense of that. And amazingly, I read a little bit later, I think it was in the Lord's Testament, a description of that experience that I had, even literally exactly as I'd experienced it. So how can you get more certain than that? That the very day that you experience this utterly liberating experience, that you come across a spiritual master who describes that experience and his purpose and his function. So I kind of express how fortunate that is, because how can you not know that once you know it? You see, I've never suffered doubt about my master, because I know what that is. And he's referred to it so many times, right? He says you must practice on the basis of recognition response. And without that, you're just trying out your own methods. And that's so true. And I'm so fortunate to be aware that that is the basis of my relationship to him. I was utterly changed in my life. And that period, that state of being, which was so unusual, so exceptional, there were several other Leelas which I'll go on to describe that started from that point on. The last one I'll say now was that when I was sitting on the bench reading this beautiful truth that my master was physically here, I would sort of fall back into a completely stationary condition where there was no disturbance of the being, because the pleasure was so great, because the freedom was so great. And I remember just sitting on the bench holding the book, and even like I don't even need to read this or do anything. There's no difference made by doing anything. And then I saw there was like 2 or 3 policemen, British policemen, right, because I'm right next to the river here, the River Thames, and there's like a raised wall. There's like 3 or 4 policemen like leaning over the wall and running along upstream near to me. Obviously something was in the river and running up or something, I don't know. It was really like loads of energy and fascination, and the whole, normally when you see something like that so dramatic, your attention is like right on it, right? But because I was in this condition, my attention didn't move. It stayed where it was, and these police doing this frantic leaning over the wall and running forward were doing their thing. And as I released my attention and yet still was seeing it, it literally, my vision literally dissolved, and I saw these forms become more like subtle. They were physical, but they were also subtle. I saw that it was light, forms of light, you see. No fundamental implication other than it being light. And that was a brief moment, but it was extraordinary to me. And I realized that if you do that with attention, in that condition, you can see beyond what we call the physical. And all of this was completely spontaneous. You can imagine I was totally incapable of doing anything like that. But I noted that, and then I jumped on my bike, went back to the flat, and then I can tell the other Leelas that came from that, the whole thing, that state of being lasted about 2 weeks. About 2 weeks before it literally closed. It felt like my brain just suddenly went click, and then I was kind of back in the more humdrum point of view again, but somehow never the same because of that fact. And I think it does something to you. That's the work of the guru, that he's always working to clear your channels so that you can enter this more profound process. I really appreciate the what's the word, the degree of commitment and sacrifice and conformity that would enable such a more profound state of being to become, as it were, normal for you. You see, there's no way round that. I can see that the practice as given by the guru is clearly the best way. So that's interesting, living with that understanding as well right from the beginning. You see, I'm well aware that if I had committed and given up what was necessary and committed what was necessary, not that I didn't do that, I did that to quite a large degree, but if I had done it without looking back, then yes, there would be a profound development in my life. But I'm always aware that that's completely potential anytime. But what can I say? I'm Sagittarian. Who knows? As I get older now, perhaps it becomes more possible, we should say. It's all extraordinary anyway, and I'm still amazed that I'm aware of it, and that there is a real potential for me to be more profound in my practice. Okay, that's my first Leela.